Good morning. That you're doing well. We're going to continue our study in the book of James. And we have started this book as God is through James, who's writing to dispersed Christians who are no longer living in Jerusalem, spread over Asia Minor. He's writing to these group of believers, trying to tell these followers of Jesus to have correct thinking and teach us to have changed or different thinking. He started the chapter talking about when life is difficult. He points out that God uses those difficulties to mature our faith. And so we're to have an adjustment in our thinking. Often we get down and things are complex when things are complex and difficult. And he says, you need to count that all joy. And then he addresses those and says that when we need wisdom, and he points to God as the one who provides wisdom for us and reminds us to follow his direction. He reminds the poor to have an eternal perspective and does the same for the wealthy. And then for those people who would make the argument that even though that God was opening a door to something, that something was against the law of God or was a sinful thing, that God was opening that door, they would essentially blame God for a door that was being opened when clearly it was not what God wanted. God addresses those people, and then he kind of addresses our thinking about sin as a whole, and saying that all the restrictions and the prescriptions of God, the things he tells us to do and the things he tells us not to do, and when violating those, when we sin against the restrictions and prescriptions of God, that produces something. It always produces ultimate destruction, and he defines that as death. And so it just brings ruin, either to our marriage, our relationships, in our own spirit, and then also can be physical death. And then he kind of carries on this idea of, is God the one who is calling us into this sin? And he picks us up in verse 16 through verse 18, which is where we're going to spend our time together this morning. He's going to identify his audience very clearly. He does it repeatedly here through his book, but he's going to identify his audience in James 1:16 as my beloved brothers. And so he's clearly identifying a Christian audience. And he tells the Christian audience not to be deceived. And he's specifically addressing their thinking. Essentially saying, don't be led astray. Don't be led into thinking something that's incorrect. Don't allow your own thinking to go this direction and ultimately convince yourself, or don't let someone else speak to you and speak into you and alter your thinking. And so he's kind of really, kind of in a large way, telling, flashing a neon sign or look at this. Don't be deceived. Don't let anything fool you in this area. And then he makes this statement to the believer. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. And so basically he's going to identify that God is a generous God, that he provides generously for us. And he says every, which is the small Greek word pas, which means that there's nothing outside, that it's all. That is, there's nothing outside the consideration of what is being considered. And so when you consider good gifts, and when you consider perfect presence, when you consider those things, all of those have come down from the Father. It says all good, and good is what is desirable, and perfect is that is without blemish, or that which is without defect. And he says gifts or presents, and he's just using kind of a little colloquial phrase to kind of grab the audience's attention and say, really, God is the one who is responsible for all that there is. And he identifies these things as gifts. And gifts are things that are given without an expectation of return. That is, there's no hope of gaining something else as a response to the gift that was given. It was a gift given with no expectation of return. And so he's dealing with the thought that God may open the door for us to sin. He's saying, oh, no, that's not true. God doesn't do that. That is our own lusts that do that. We're enticed, and then ultimately that leads to destruction. And he juxtaposes that, and he says, don't be fooled. God is the giver of good and perfect gifts, things that he does not expect any payment in return. He is the one who gives all that we possess that is good. And it comes down, it says coming down from the Father of lights. And we'll talk about that in a second. But James, about what Father of lights refers to. James is here identifying something about the nature and character of God. God is a generous God. And in his generosity, God is good to his children. Psalms chapter 24, verses 1 and 2 says, the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell within. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. All that is in the earth belongs to the Lord. And so you can go through what you have, and you can give thanks and praise to God, your Father, for his generosity in your life. You can thank God for the day. You can thank God for the beauty of the day. And you can thank God for the provision that you have and the family that you have and for the hope that you have in Jesus Christ and the relationships that you enjoy and the communion and fellowship that you experience with other people. These are gifts that God gives to us. And he is defined here as the Father of lights. The Father of lights refers to God as the creator of all, and essentially all the creator that gives us light. And so he is the Father of lights. And so he's identifying God as the creator. And so he's saying God is generous, and he is also the creator. And so there's nothing outside of God's control, outside of God's power, outside of God's influence, and outside of God's ability to manage, that he is the creator. And so you can't say, I created this, or I have this good in my life, and I have this good because I did, because all good and perfect gifts come from the Father, who is the creator of all that there is. And so James is going to kind of tag on with this idea that God is the Father of lights, and he's the creator, and he's going to kind of use the terminology, the light terminology here in this next phrase, where he says, with whom, God, the Father of lights, so the good and perfect gifts are coming down from the Father of lights, with whom, that is with God, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. And the phrase shadow due to change is kind of a play off of God being the Father of lights. So he started out saying that God is generous. Then he said that God is the creator. Then he brings out this beautiful attribute of God, that God is immutable, that God does not and cannot and will not change. That God, the creator of all, God, the one who gives good to us, every good and every perfect gift, comes from the creator. And that creator doesn't experience any change. In that creator, he doesn't experience a shadow due to change, or an inference to change, or an inclination to change. And there is no variation with God. That is, God does not, it is in his very nature that God is immutable, that he does not change. And so he's carrying forward this idea that God may tempt us with evil, He's saying, no, God doesn't tempt us with evil. Evil comes when we're tempted of our own lusts and desires and enticed by sin, and sin brings forth destruction, brings forth death. Instead, we should not be tricked into thinking that God brings forth evil. Instead, we, as followers of Jesus, as beloved brothers, should recognize that every good and every perfect gift comes from the Creator God, who is incapable of changing or even the appearance or slight inference to change, that God does not change, that God gives to his children good things. And then he finishes this with verse 18. And in verse 18, James just really quickly summarizes the gospel and introduces just really quickly for the believer, reminding the believer of the evidences of God's goodness. This is what he says. Of his own will. So by God's own design and God's own desire, that is, there's no force or pressing that is outside of God that is requiring God to act. As God is being forced to act because of a need that he possesses, or by oppressing that something else is occurring in his life. No. Instead, by a simple choice of his own desire, of his own wish, by his own will, he, God, brought us forth by the word of truth. Now, the word of truth here refers to the gospel. And so by God's own design and God's own wish and God's own plan, he brought us forth, or we were born again by the gospel. That is, God doesn't have a need for us. God isn't lacking in community and fellowship. God is not in some way broken and in need of something else. And so he made us, and then we were not in relationship with him because of sin, but he needed us. And so he saved us to fill that need. No, it's in fact, God is the creator of all, and there's something outside of him that he lacks. There's nothing that exists outside of him, and he lacks nothing. He is the giver of every good and perfect gift, and an illustration of the good and perfect gift that God has given to us is that by his own design, by his own will, by his own movement, he, using the gospel, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, has brought us forth, that we should be, he finishes, a kind of first fruits of his creation. And that phrasing simply means that we would be a special possession, or possessing a special standing with God, which is the direct result of the gospel. So the gospel brings us into a relationship with God, and we're adopted into the family of God, and we are joint heirs with Jesus Christ, and heaven is now our possession. The Holy Spirit of God indwells us, and we're sealed until the day of redemption. And heaven is our eternal possession. And so we are a special possession of God. We are a kind of first fruits of his creation, or of all that he has created. He is the creator, the Father of lights. Of all that he has created, of his own will, he brought us forth by the gospel. And we are now to God a special possession to him. And he kind of finishes, James kind of finishes this section as he addresses this charge that was made against God. That God opens doors that may lead us to sinfulness, or God may entice us to sin, which there were some New Testament rabbis that taught something like that. And James is addressing that and rejecting that and saying, no, that's not true. We are enticed to sin by our own internal desires. And then when we allow that to develop, it brings forth a sin and ultimate destruction and death. And he says, no, don't be deceived into thinking that about God. God doesn't change. He is immutable. He is the creator. He is the one who gives to us every good and every perfect gift. And to illustrate every good and every perfect gift that God has given to us, James says, by God's own inclination, by his own desire, by his own wish, he redeemed a people through the gospel and made us to be a special possession of God. Now, when you understand the beauty and wonder of the gospel, when you understand how lost we were, how God did not, in fact, need us, but God chose to redeem us by sending his one and only Son to die on the cross for us, for our sin. The natural response is to wonder to yourself, how do I respond to a God like that? How do I respond to a God like that? You can't pay him back. You can't buy these good and perfect gifts. These are gifts. God gives us things that you don't purchase. So how do you respond? And the response for the follower of Jesus is simply adoration and worship and devotion and praise. It is to give God the glory that is due his name and the wonder and gratitude of what he has done for us, to live our lives reflective of worship and praise and honor to a God who, of his own will, using the gospel, brought us forth and made us the first fruits of his creation, or the most prized possession of all of his creation. Church, if you're a follower of Jesus, you are God's prized possession. You are loved. He deeply loves you. He loves you so much that by his own wish, by his own will, he sent his Son to die for you so that he could possess you and he could be in eternal relationship with you. And that is the God we love. And that is the God we worship. That is the God we adore. That is the God we follow. That is the God to which we live our lives of ultimate gratitude for. So we live in times of uncertainty, but in times of uncertainty, we are certain of this. We serve an immutable God who redeemed us, driven by his own love for us. What a wonderful God we serve. When we get together, we'll continue our study through Galatians chapter 1. We'll get together on Thursday. Today's Tuesday, and my days all run together because they're starting to look the same. We'll get together on Thursday at 10:30 in the morning. Remember, church, this week we have Words of Worship at 3 o'clock, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We're going to do that through this entire quarantine. And we're also looking forward to our Easter celebration. Last Sunday we had drive-in church, and it was fantastic. It really was a wonderful time together. And so we're excited about doing that again. So we're going to do drive-in church on Sunday at 9 o'clock on our campus. We're set up outside, and we're going to do it rain or shine. If it rains, we'll do it in the front. If it doesn't rain, we'll have it in the back. There's a little more parking in the back. We don't have to worry about if we don't have to worry about rain, then we don't worry about cover, and we can use the back parking lot. And we hope to see you Sunday at 9:30. Even though you're in your car, you still get to see others' faces, and it's enjoyable. And we will do our regular 10:45 live stream that we have been doing all along. Look in your inbox for information about student ministry events that are coming up online, and also our children's ministry. For our Easter celebration, we have a craft that we want our parents to do with our children if they're pre-K through 5th grade. We want you to stop by the church at between 9:30 and 11:30 Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday this week, and pick up the materials that you're going to need to do the teaching of with your children on Sunday. We'll do video instruction, but there will be a craft that you need to work with your children on. We were going to do that on site, but we've decided because of all that's going on, we can't have a service inside, or don't want to have service inside. And so we're going to make those available. So church, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday this week, 9:30 to 11:30, drive up under the awning up front and get your Easter materials for pre-K through 5th grade. Lord bless you, church. Love you guys. Good to see you today. We will see you soon. I'm praying for you. Have a wonderful day.